Let me start by just saying a little bit about the book. So, the book's title is Brighter: Optimism, Progress, and the Future of Environmentalism. I'm reading an advanced copy. I think it's the same as what people will get in their hands when they order it, right? Is there any substantial difference between this?
Nope, you just got a sneak peek at the real deal, basically.
Yep, okay. And I'm going to embarrass Adam by reading the about the author part at the back because
Oh, oh man.
because it's cool. And I guess both Chad and Matt have been around for a while and maybe heard this, but maybe not. So Adam is the director of research at the independent think tank Rethink X. His work covers policy making, investment, public understanding around new technologies, transportation and energy, transportation and food. Uh, So I met Adam while he was doing his PhD at UCLA in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and he also has an MS at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. Uh, yeah, maybe that's enough of that. So let me see. Where do I
Yeah,
want to start? Yeah, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, yeah, that's pretty good. Sums up where I am at this point in my life pretty well.
Oh, and also, of course,
Those
his
days at UCLA feel like a long time ago, Dan. I
yeah,
remember I remember vividly first chatting with you in front of the fountain at the
yeah.
sculpture garden
That's right. I never would have
on
met you
UCLA's campus.
if it
That was
wasn't
great.
if it wasn't for your dog's obsession with biting water.
Yeah, that's right.
We would
Oh,
have
yeah,
never
that's
been
right.
friends.
Oh, wonderful old Callisto. She passed a couple of years ago, but she was a great dog, and she loved that fountain at UCLA. Man, she's black lab, so Labradors are famous for being water dogs. And of course, everybody walks past, and Dan was no exception. It just couldn't help but laugh with delight at seeing this dog just having the time of her life in the water. So anyway, yeah, it was she brought us together. So it was well done, Callisto.
And I forgot your most important affiliation is that you're organizer of this seminar, right? So that's on there at the end too. Uh,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think maybe regularly invited, imperfect track record of attendance, and definitely Dan, you are the one who makes all of this happen. So thank you.
sure. Yeah, maybe the most important thing I'd advertise about this book, and I said this via email to Adam earlier, is that it's an antidote to despair. And this is something you talk about in the very first page, if I remember correctly. Uh, so I want to maybe start with that. You talk about it in the book quite a bit. Uh, but what is the despair that this book is an antidote to, and where does it come from?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is the fundamental motivation behind this piece of work. I mean, I have, in general, have had a long-standing interest in both the environment and in technology, and those are they're sort of, in my mind, um, they are they're chief concerns of mine because uh, the world that we share with other living things is miraculous and priceless and, uh, as far as we can tell, unique and in almost inconceivably vast and bleak and otherwise lifeless universe. So far, when to our dismay, we have not been able to detect a universe teeming with life so far. So everything that we know suggests that the Earth is incredibly precious, and the other living things that we share it with deserve to be valued accordingly. And uh, as far as technology goes, I have been a lifelong, um, uh, a lifelong. I want to find the right word. Devotee is probably not the right word, but I have been a life, and I'm avoiding the use of the word fan. But I have been someone who, for my entire life, has been deeply inspired with the possibility and the promise of a brighter future built on human innovation and continuing to discover new things about our world and continuing to build a more and more capable set of tools with which to improve not just human life, but our entire planet. And so it's these twin interests that come together in this book, technology and the environment. And this is surprisingly rare. It's surprisingly unusual because not everyone who cares deeply about the environment is the kind of fan of technology and its promise as I am. These tend to be sets of people that don't overlap all that much. I think, in my view, they overlap discouragingly little. I wish they overlap completely, but they don't. And so you have, we have on the one hand, this deep concern for the environment, and on the other hand, this deep and interest in the potential of humanity to develop the tools with which to make a much brighter and more exciting and just a future of greater possibility. Okay, when you put these two things together, magic happens, which is that the environment needs intervention. It needs protection. We have problems that must be solved. We have challenges that we face that we have to meet. And this is many words have been used to describe it over the years. The sustainability challenge is now, a key part of the lexicon here, but sustainability isn't the only lens through which to think about concerns for the environment. But the idea here is that technology can play a fundamental role in helping us solve our environmental problems, meet our environmental challenges, and ultimately achieve our environmental aspirations. Those are not identical things: problems, challenges, and aspirations. I touch on that a little bit at the very end of the book. But to begin with, and certainly the bulk of the book and the bulk of this story is about solving problems. We face major problems, and so technology, I argue, is our best hope for solving those problems, and indeed quite likely our only real plausible hope of solving them in pragmatic terms. In other words, in a way that doesn't result in unacceptable collateral damage to human civilization and the quality of life we aspire to. Okay, so that is all preface to answer Dan's real question, which is, why are people in such a state of despair? Why are we so discouraged about this? Not just the current state of the environment, that is discouraging, and we have to accept the reality of that. Indeed, one of the things that I stress in the book is that the state of affairs is in some ways worse than most environmentalists realize. Certainly, that's the case with climate change. I argue pretty clearly and unequivocally in the book that the challenge and the problem of climate change is worse than most people realize. And it is going to be a harder problem to solve than most people realize. So not only is it about recognizing the current state of affairs, but a lot of the despair, in my mind, emerges from what is a widespread perception, and I would say misconception, about our opportunities to solve those problems. In other words, our prospects of actually meeting these challenges. That, I think, is at the heart of the despair. Now, there are other less fundamental, more proximate causes for despair. The current state of the economy, the current plight of young people in the Anglosphere, in Western countries, and especially perhaps in the United States. There are many statistics one could cite that especially around jobs and employment and that sort of thing, that make this a discouraging environment at present. No, I should avoid the use of the word environment there. I meant climate circumstances. economic circumstances, and social circumstances. There are many things that make this a difficult, very, very difficult moment, especially for young people worldwide, and especially for young people in some of the world's wealthy countries. In the United States, it comes to mind there, of course. But there are more what you might consider less ultimate and more proximate causes of despair. And I don't mean to trivialize these. It's not that they're superficial. It's not that they're trivial. It's that they are shallow causes, perhaps more so than deep causes, deep underlying causes. And there we get to things like just the biases that people have in how they digest the news and the way the media reports on stories, a general emphasis on negativity that is ascendant over the last generations, over the last 15 to 20 years, certainly. The negativity bias in news coverage has become exacerbated. The polarization politically of people over the last number of years, partly as a consequence of the impact of social media, and many other forces and factors like that, are all converging to make people despair. But the underlying most important driver behind that despair is we now recognize scientifically, and there's broad consensus about this, that climate change in particular and many other environmental problems are very, very serious. And the state of the planet is deteriorating. These things are now no longer questionable. There's not much room for debate on those particular topics. The time has passed in which there was a plausible debate about whether climate change was real, about whether climate change posed a serious threat to ecological integrity and stability and to human welfare, and whether or not there were other major ecological problems. And one could list many of them, from air pollution and water pollution to biodiversity loss and species extinction to ocean acidification and so on. We face many, many challenges. By most metrics, the integrity of the biosphere is deteriorating as a result of human action. And that is probably the fundamental reason for despair. Things for the environment are getting worse, and people don't see a way out. People don't see a path to rectifying that miserable trajectory. And so that is sort of the fundamental thing that's going on there. There is another, and if I could, I want to read this and see if it resonates with you guys. I set up a train of thought in the book, and this is what I experience and what I perceive when I talk to many people, especially young people who inhabit this mindset of despair. And if I could, I'd like to read this to you and see what you think. And it's this idea that so let me just preface it very quickly. This idea that humanity has made something of a Faustian bargain, right? That there's, up until now, there has been a fundamental trade-off between human prosperity and ecological well-being and integrity. And we have bought all of our prosperity. We have purchased all of our modern quality of life at the expense of the environment, and that the bill is finally coming due. And we've made this terrible bargain, and we're now on the precipice of, the devil's coming to get his due, and off we go to purgatory or inferno, right? Okay, so the train of thought in my experience goes something like this, and now I'm reading from the book. Our common sense screams at us that solving problems takes prosperity. And so if we really truly cannot solve climate change with prosperity, as the conventional narrative goes, then we don't stand a snowball's chance in hell of solving climate change without it. So then, when we hear authorities of various stripes proclaiming that the solution is just to think optimistically and embrace austerity with a plucky attitude, It sets off our bullshit detector like a fire alarm. It has all the ring of desperation to it, because we would never even consider the nonsense of trading one disaster for another if a real solution were available. Well, okay, but then what if climate change really is, in fact, an unsolvable problem? And the authorities are just too afraid to admit it openly. But we will all just have to learn to live with climate change, won't we? But wait, if climate change is indeed the catastrophic existential risk that the scientific community says it is, then there won't be any learning to live with it, will there? It's a no-win scenario. We're all just toast. So that is I set that up as a caricature is not the right word for it, but this is the mindset, the chain of thought that I perceive running through many people's heads.
Yeah,
and that is at the center of this despair.
I think that's very accurate. Yeah, I like that passage. Although I would maybe put a slightly different spin on the end of that. I think it's not that, well, I think many people don't necessarily just conclude that we're all toast. They conclude most of us are toast. Therefore, I better start playing all the zero-sum games I can find to make sure I'm on the life raft.
Yeah, I think that we can. That's a very good point, Dan. I think that I'm sort of characterizing a stereotypical response, and the stereotypical response that I see are from people who have deep concern about the environment, but whose reaction is despair in the form of giving up. But there are also people whose reaction to this despair is, well, okay, get out of my way. I'm gonna shove everybody else out of the way, and man, I'm gonna be one of the people on the life raft. Because if it can't be everybody, well, I'm going to be on there, and to hell with everybody else for sure. That's right. It's definitely a game theoretical situation. And then I think there's another possibility here, or another sort of response to that to that despair. And I don't see this as often, but it is kind of the eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Sort of let's party like it's 1999 kind of attitude, where, well, okay, well, I mean, if we're all toast and nothing matters, might as well have a fun time on the sinking ship, kind of thing. And but to my mind, these are all just flavors of despair, and they fundamentally differ from an optimistic perspective. Yeah, preppers. That's another one. Boy, I had not thought of that. That is another one. You're right. I do not encounter that mindset very often, I have to say. But I've heard of it, of course.
Maybe I'll just make an observation, which I think you'll agree with, which is that it's probably not that these thoughts are conscious in many people's minds on these topics, or I mean, maybe there's quite a few people who have thought through it carefully and come to this conclusion consciously, and then, as you discuss in the book, decide, for example, to not have children on the basis of what they think is a pretty clear, rational view of what the future will be like. But probably for many more people, it's just that these thoughts are latent, and they're kind of deductions that they don't wish to make, but nonetheless their unconscious is making for them, which at the level of a society sort of has profound impacts that maybe are hard to tie down to any particular. It's not that you can necessarily point to, say, suicide rates or some other kind of metric and be like, okay, yeah, 20% of that is due to pessimism about climate change, but there are enough dots to connect here that it's hard to escape the conclusion that latent thoughts like this are having a widespread and pernicious effect on the society.
I completely agree with that. And I think that the body of evidence is growing to support that conclusion. The evidence that I'm aware of centers around what is now being termed eco-anxiety. And there's good large-scale research, large N surveys, tens of thousands of people now, dozens of countries, that is starting to corroborate, that what up until now, I suppose, has really just been conjecture. You and I, Dan, have been talking about this for a number of years, that there is the corrosive mindset of pessimism emerging around a fear that there is no future because climate change is dooming us to a bleak or miserable future, either no future at all or some Mad Max, horrible scenario, a dystopian future. That people despair about this, and that despair has real impact on their quality of life, on their actions, on their decisions. So this is a real this is definitely a real phenomenon. We are not imagining this. This is now documented. It's not a question of if at this point. At this point, it is a matter of answering the question: how bad is this? How severe is this? What real consequences are resulting? And and that's not even getting into the potential harm that could be caused by prescribing the wrong policy responses to this misapprehension about our potential to solve these environmental problems. That's a different question. I'm speaking here strictly in psychological, I suppose, and sociological terms, not the damage that can be done by misguided policymaking. And by that I mean, if we take seriously the idea that we cannot solve our environmental problems and meet the sustainability challenge any way other than to torpedo our economies deliberately, and plunge societies deliberately into poverty and privation and all of the and everything that goes along with that, that's separate. That kind of suffering, that's all a separate issue. I'm strictly speaking about how much people are suffering and the real damage that's being done now as a result of this, which again, it's easy to, I think it's easy to dismiss the severity of this because it's diffuse, right? But it's the kind of thing that you have a few anecdotes and that tear at your heart. I have many of these. I talk to people and they say, no, well, the future's so bleak, we're not going to have children. And that crushes me. That just absolutely breaks my heart. But but that's just a single anecdote. When you have research come back, as we now are starting to see, where a survey of tens of thousands of people across dozens of countries is showing that 40% or more of young people under the age of 20 report substantial impacts on their lives and on their decisions because of eco-anxiety, especially around climate change. You have to look at that statistically. You have to think in terms, okay, well, if there are 8 billion people that this is applying to, that is a very large number. Any percentage of a number that big is a large number of people. And that is an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, an unconscionable amount of unnecessary suffering.
Okay, that's a good summary of the despair. Before we get to the antidote part, I want to go a bit deeper into the black. So, regarding your book, so your book is a weapon to take on doomsaying about climate change in particular, but I think the problem is deeper than that, and maybe your book is sufficient to that monster, but maybe it's not sufficient to the bigger monster I want to hold it up against. So let me outline what I think is the bigger monster, and then you can, let's see what you think of that. So I'm going to write on the board a bit, so if you watch there. So here's climate change and related issues has posed a very deep challenge to basically our whole philosophical understructure in the West, I would say. I think it's not hyperbole to frame things that broadly. Here's how I see it. So Enlightenment values, Adam basically summarized that at the beginning of this seminar, right? And I would say Adam strikes me as a kind of quintessential Enlightenment values guy, right? The idea that will solve problems. What matters is what's happening here in the real world. Individuals matter. We'll use knowledge to solve problems. Problems can all be solved with enough knowledge. Let's go get the knowledge. Changing things is worth doing. Much of the time, you're not doomed to always fail if you attempt to improve things. We have solved problems in the past. We still have problems, but we'll go forward and we'll solve them. And that's a kind of attitude that hasn't always historically been normal. It's in some sense abnormal historically, and it's not all of the Enlightenment, but and the scientific revolution, but it's a big central plank of that. And let me outline some events in the last couple of 100 years that have percolated down to us now and sort of merged with the concern around climate change and are now going back to undermine I think you refer to it as the wellspring of progress, Adam, in your book. I forget whereabouts exactly this is, but so here's some of the outcomes of this emphasis on knowledge and science and technology. Well, pursuing knowledge and science gave us lots of nice things, but it also led to nuclear weapons and to climate change and to insanities like gain-of-function research, which, depending how many times we have pandemics like this that are plausibly linked to it, could easily undermine science or change the public attitude towards it as much as nuclear weapons did, I would say.
Yes, yes.
There's also the emphasis on individuals in the Enlightenment, which is nowadays, people are very skeptical of it under the name of sort of consumerism. People do not trust individuals to make choices. They think that other people's preferences should be shaped often, or they should be kind of encouraged to not choose to do the things they want to do. You can look at any individual case of that, like, say, people like to drink too many sugary drinks, and maybe it doesn't seem that profound, but there's been a substantial shift in many of our societies away from trusting people to act on their own preferences to thinking that maybe they ought to be kind of directed quite a bit. And that goes often under the name of just sort of thinking consumerism is a really bad thing in the world, and also capitalism.
I want to put a stop here. Maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah, good.
I think that if you go back to John Stuart Mill, I've got the book here. I'll try and find a quote, and we can talk about it later or now if you're happy to wait for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me get that book. It's going to take me a while actually to find the quote, I think, because it's a big book.
Okay, I'll keep speaking. I think probably that's okay, and you can keep looking. Yeah. So some of these, it's not obvious that you should have these views on knowledge, science, and individualism. And for example, many people in China and other cultures do not. We think of them as it's the water we swim in the West, or maybe it's the water we swam in. And they're not automatic beliefs, and many of us inherit them without examining them or really deriving them for ourselves or thinking about them very clearly. And to the degree that's true, it's actually easy for them to be supplanted by different ideas. And I think many people believe that's happening. It's been happening slowly and now quite rapidly, I would say, in the West. And there are many reasons, and to this list on the right-hand side I could add colonialism and oppression of minorities and racism and many other issues that are of current concern. Now you can argue that it's not appropriate to tie nuclear weapons back to the Enlightenment and blame the sword of Damocles that hangs over all of us and has for decades on Enlightenment values. But that's also naive. It's too cheap. There is some truth to that critique. There is some truth to the idea that by freeing science and allowing status and resources to scientists, you do end up with things like gain-of-function research. That's not, as you could say, that's a corruption of the Enlightenment ideals, but it's also maybe intrinsic, and it's too cheap to just dismiss that outright. So there's a valid and hard to refute not impossible to refute, but not trivial to refute argument that these Enlightenment values knowledge, the pursuit of science for its own sake, the belief that by deploying knowledge you can solve problems, and that the proper locus of concern is the individual. These have led to not one but multiple potential apocalypses, if that's the correct plural. First it was nuclear weapons. Maybe we, by the skin of our teeth, escaped that, but then we rolled straight into climate change, and if we solve that, maybe it's AGI or something like that. And I think lurking behind this despair that Adam is talking about is maybe this is just one head of the hydra, the climate change despair. Maybe there's a deeper despair, which is that actually we were wrong, right? Actually the Enlightenment idea that we can solve all our problems by knowledge, well, it's an empirical question, and maybe history has proven it wrong. Well, not yet, because the world is still here, but it's not the kind of question you get to debate afterwards. Once the world has ended, maybe it's too late to change your mind. So I would say that the Steelman case for the opposition to technological solutions to environmental problems is part of a general overall rejection of the Enlightenment in total. And just to say that, well, you think knowledge will solve all your problems? Maybe it solved a lot of them, but in the end, well, what does it matter? 100 years, 200 years of this philosophy, and you end up with multiple potential apocalypses. Maybe it's better just to sit there in ignorance and last for thousands of years in a substandard condition. So yeah, what do you say to that, Adam?
I think that's great. I think it's strong. Let me add a couple of things to it, at least, or maybe several, another facet or two to the same underlying picture that we're looking at. One would be that technology, as you know, in the book, I define technology as a form of knowledge. It's practical knowledge, and by that, what I mean is, in practice, it's knowledge that allows us to affect change in the world, in line with realizing whatever goals we might have, values and goals we might have. And that's a fancy pants way of saying that technology empowers us. And I don't mean power as in like social, social hierarchies and political power, not that kind of power. What I'm talking about is physical power. Technology, like any tool, increases the reach of it increases our causal power with respect to the rest of of reality that we interact with. That is what technology, that is what tools do. That is their entire purpose, is to make us able to enact more change. Well, of course, the problem with that is that in itself is sort of agnostic as far as its value. It does not contain values per se. Technology is not inherently good. I think that's an easy mistake to make, just assuming that technology is inherently good. But the corollary of that is that technology is not inherently bad either. What technology does is it empowers us, and it empowers us to do greater things that are both more good and more bad. And at the extreme, that threatens us with apocalypse, nuclear weapons. Climate change is not sort of a something we're directly aiming at, but that is an unintended consequence. But the tools have now become so powerful. We have stolen fire from the gods, and we wield it at our very grave peril. Right? This is the idea. And concerns about this are ancient. They do date to classical antiquity. I mean, you can burn your house down if you're playing with fire. When firearms were first invented, and the idea that every person could have catastrophically lethal force in their hand, any person could suddenly become lethally dangerous to anyone else. This was terrifying, right? Compared to a world without that power, without that technology, this seems absolutely horrifying. So I would add, I would just nuance this a bit by making the point about that technology is empowering for good and ill. And then the next thing that I would say is, and again, this is we're kind of constructing a steel man here, I think, as you said. The next thing to say is environmentalists are quite right when they point to problems that are a consequence of utilizing technology. There's no denying that, right? Many of the environmental problems, and of course other problems as well, but in many environmental problems are a result of utilizing technology. Now I argue in the book that these are unintended consequences, and that specific character, the lack of intention there, means that those consequences are amenable to solutions, and there's a lot of logic that flows around that. But one cannot deny, I don't think reasonably, there can be no reasonable denial that technology is responsible for many of the environmental problems we face. Now, technology has to be in somebody's hands. It is a tool. Just sitting on the shelf, it doesn't do that harm. It must be utilized in order to cause harm. But we do utilize our technology. It does cause harm. Much of that harm is unintended with respect to the environment. But none of that diminishes the fact that the harm is real. And so environmentalists are on firm ground when they say technology has caused these problems. Yes, that is it's not the whole truth, but it is part of the truth. And I think we cannot deny that. So then the response and the arguments that must follow have to take that into account.
Yeah, maybe one way to put it is that, so of course technology can be used for good or ill. So if you're going to open Pandora's box, then you need to have the presumption that it's possible to maybe get more of the good than bad. And that's an empirical question, right? Can you, if you allow the technology, I mean, presuming you have some ability to stop it, which maybe is the deeper point here, that it's a fantasy to imagine you can just not have it. But if that is under your control, and you have to presume that there's some way of getting more of the good than the bad, but then that's an empirical question. So I think my deepest challenge to your book is something like the following. Where is the line? You have to admit that there might come a time when even you would say, okay, we were wrong, and actually technological progress, even though maybe we don't see any good alternatives, it is too dangerous to continue, and we need to end science. Put the scientists in monasteries, build walls around them, make sure none of those bastards ever wreck things again. There could come a point in which you agree that, it would have to be pretty extreme, but AGI might lead to that, right? On the last day of the human race, even you, Adam, might conclude, oopsies. So, assuming that you agree there's a point at which you would acknowledge that this was a mistake, well, maybe we should forecast that in advance. What are the signs that we should stop? And maybe you don't have a good answer to that question. Maybe you don't want to actually think about that. And maybe that's actually the point at which maybe they don't have an articulated message for where that line was, but you'd have to say that a lot of people in the world today think we've gone past that line. And I would say they're my political enemies in some sense. I don't agree with them. I think you're right. But I don't also know where that line is myself, and since I don't know where it is, it could be behind me. So why are you so sure the line is in front of you?
My response to that is that I'm going to pull a fast one on you here, Dan, and that is I don't accept the premise, and here's what I don't accept about it. I don't accept that technology is monolithic enough to characterize in this way. In other words, I think technologies must be evaluated on a case by case basis with this against this challenge, against this critique. I think we absolutely failed in that challenge with nuclear weapons 75 or more years ago. And it is a miracle that we have gone this long without catastrophe resulting as a consequence of that scientific and technological uh, advancement. I would hesitate to even call that progress, right? The development of nuclear weapons. That is definitely something that's behind us, and we are incredibly lucky that we have not annihilated a major portion of human civilization in the biosphere with a nuclear exchange. And make no mistake, we are still in danger of that. The danger is not gone. But I don't agree that. Okay, well, let me continue, and then I'll explain why I don't agree. So, continuing that, today we seem to have lines of research, gain of function research. I agree, seems to be absolutely unjustifiably reckless. The benefits do not remotely justify the risk, as far as we can tell. And that is separate from whether or not how plausible you think the possibility is of a lab leak of the recent coronavirus and the pandemic that resulted and killed tens of millions of people. That seems to me to be quite a plausible possibility, although we may never know the truth. But at any rate, it's plausible enough that this seems like madness to continue this line of work. And I agree, although I remain optimistic, I do agree that AGI could pose an existential risk. That still lies ahead of us. And I would very much entertain debates with respect to the biotech, gain of function being one form of research there, and AGI research. I would very much seriously entertain a debate about whether we should put that specific technological progress to a halt, whether we should as a society try to prevent further progress in those areas. But I don't. So here's where I push back on the premise and disagree. I don't think that the threat of AGI or of a man-made bioweapons or just accidental biological catastrophe justifies a wholesale, comprehensive dismissal of technology and writ large, but rather those deserve case-by-case discussions about whether those should be outlawed, and how aggressively they should be outlawed and how aggressively they should be penalized. And we can argue about the practicalities. Maybe it's very naive to expect they even could be outlawed, and so forth. But that would be my response, which is that you can't demonize or reify technology as a whole. You must do so on a case-by-case basis. And then for practical terms, it goes both ways as well. It may be impractical to try to shut down, research into AGI. Maybe that's just not practical. But by the same token, it just isn't practical to shut down all technological research or advancement either. How would we do that? So yes, that would be my response to that challenge.
Have you heard of the Dark Ages? We could try hard and get it back if we really wanted. Yeah. So yeah, I buy that, but it seems like it's not taking into account the political economy of actually trying to stop the bad lines of research. In practice, we can't do that. I mean, it's not like anybody sat around and thought, I mean, it's not like the public got a say on gain of function research, or even the majority of people in government or positions. I doubt most virologists or epidemiologists were given a survey to ask, do you think that gain of function research is a good idea? Probably a majority of them thought it was a terrible idea, but it happened anyway. I don't know the exact story of how it happened, but it came down ultimately to some careers being involved. People could get big grants, and so they did. Now, we could spend many seminars talking about what's dysfunctional about big science and how these kinds of things happen and continue to happen. It's not like gain of function research has stopped, right? The people are still getting grants to do this insane research. So I don't think it's safe to go halfway. We should just end it all. Or that's what this position would say. I think it sounds extreme, but I don't think this is actually very far from, it's maybe latent, but it's pretty close to being a mainstream political view, I would think, and would become more mainstream the more powerful we get. So what I have in mind is that the disruptions you're talking about in this book involve incredible gains in the leverage that human beings have over the physical world. The next few decades will see as much change in that capacity as we've had over the last 100 years, 200 years, maybe orders of magnitude more. Whatever worries we have about the impact of gains in human knowledge and power now, they are child's play compared to what we'll be able to do soon. So why would it...
I very much avoided making that statement, which I have to say I overwhelmingly agree with, in the book or in my professional work. I'm allowing it to sneak out here in this particular seminar. I'm uttering it out loud consciously, not by mistake. But I don't shout that from the rooftops. That is very much my core belief, that our real job is to just hang in there, because every problem becomes solvable in pretty short order, if we don't have an apocalypse. But that sounds too complacent, and in many ways it is too complacent.
Well, it's
and
not
the thing
complacent,
that is,
it's reckless.
Well, it is both. It's complacent and it's reckless because of what happens today between here and there. That's the thing. That's where all of my real work focuses on. And what that distinguishes me, I think, and perhaps you, Dan, and others, from a more naive, sort of singularity-minded sort of approach, where we just don't worry about here, and it's all long-termism. It's all concern about the future and just getting to that takeoff point, or getting to that, getting to the city on the hill, or whatever metaphors you might want to invoke. And I don't find that acceptable, because it does, in some very important sense, devalue the present, and the suffering and the hardship and the difficulty of people in the present moment. But I think these things are not inherently incompatible. You can care very, very much and very deeply about problems right now, and try desperately hard and think that it's very, very important to solve them right now, and at the same time also believe that at some not too distant point in the future, those very same problems will be trivialities. They will be solved as easily as we handle things that were once terribly difficult challenges for our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago. So I think it's possible to do both of those, to have both of those be not for there to be no contradiction in those two ideas.
That's all well and good, but I think Dan is saying something stronger, which is, like, you seem to think that this vastly improved power that we can bank on in the future is going to be used for good to solve problems. Whereas I think Dan is saying that a corollary of having that power is that you're going to have things like gain of function research, you're going to have accidents, and because then the stakes are raised so high, the accidents will be even more impactful in a negative way. Or something like that. Back to Dan.
Yeah, maybe I want to push the logic to the next part of the argument of the book, which is, I think you, in the context of climate change, your answer, Adam, is that we don't have a choice because we've already done the damage and we're toast unless we fix it. And you could make that
That's
argument on many other fronts, right? You could say, well, we have X billion people in the world and we have to feed them, or we have all these other problems, and the problems we have are severe enough that we're toast if we don't solve them. So what are you going to do? Dark Ages is not a solution. Now, if it were a solution, then we could argue about whether it's demanded or not, or like even morally necessary or not. But it isn't a solution. So, well, we have to keep going. That seems to be the argument. Am I correct?
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah, that's a very succinct and way of putting it. And I agree. The only elaboration I'll add is that, and the way I frame it or phrase it, I suppose, in the book and in my other work, is that the catastrophe, the apocalypses we are imagining being possible as a consequence of certainly as a consequence of climate change, perhaps the catastrophe that resulted from even from nuclear war. It is possible that the apocalypse resulting from a catastrophic collapse of the global economy could be just as bad as that. Now, people, in my experience, let me just go down this little sidetrack here very quickly. In my experience, there is an enormous amount of naivety among some stripes of environmentalists. I encounter this a lot, and perhaps it's partly as young people, but I encountered this a great deal when I was teaching undergraduate students, for example. And what I encountered was a failure to appreciate how far we could fall without without the amenities of the modern global economy and the quality of life it gives us. What I'm trying to say here is that we take an awful lot for granted, and it's very easy to romanticize and be very naive about what a life of poverty and privation really looks like. And in my experience, many people who are willing to entertain that as an alternative to climate catastrophe don't know how big of a catastrophe that kind of poverty actually is, because they've never lived it and they've never seen it. This probably goes back to my childhood. I spent some of the formative years of my childhood living in the early 1980s, living in some of the world's poorest countries. So I lived in the Gambia in West Africa, for example. And as a very young child, I saw what true poverty looks like. What life without electricity, medicine, running water, light, enough food to eat, what starvation looks like, what leprosy looks like, what children dying really looks like, of preventable illnesses. It's easy to read, 4 million children under the age of 5 die of diarrheal illness today in 2022. It's very easy to read that and just think of it as a statistic. Sorry, excuse me, guys. It's totally different to see it. And so this is all a way of, and I don't mean to be dramatic here, but this is all a way to make the point that I think we do not appreciate how an economic collapse globally would be an apocalypse, very much like the worst case apocalypses we imagine occurring as a result of climate change. And in that case, when I read the passage earlier in this session, that's what I mean by exchanging one catastrophe for another. The social catastrophe that resulted from a complete collapse of the global economy, which is what we would have if we tried to degrow and downsize by 80% or more. That would be every bit as disastrous as the worst of what people are imagining could happen as a consequence of climate change. Now, maybe nuclear war would be worse. And maybe AGI vaporizing all of us or enslaving all of us or something like that would be worse. But certainly in the case of climate change, the worst possible consequences of climate change for humanity would be comparable to a deliberate collapsing of the global economy. And I think that it's very easy for the folks in this sort of the degrowth camp to completely and utterly fail to grapple with that fact.
Yeah, I think we're just going to live like hobbits or something. Yeah, Matt, you wanted to add that quote in from before. What was that?
Yeah, well, actually, I've got another one while you were talking. I think you like this one, Dan. It's from The Human Use of Human Beings by Norbert Wiener. Let me just read this. We are in the position of the man who has only two ambitions in life. One is to invent the universal solvent, which will dissolve any solid substance. And the second is to invent the universal container, which will hold any liquid. Whatever this inventor does, he will be frustrated. Anyway, that's not the important part. Anyway, it gets important now. Furthermore, as I have already said, no secret will ever be as safe when its protection is a matter of human integrity as when it was dependent on the difficulties of scientific discovery itself. I've already said that the dissemination of any scientific secret, whatever, is merely a matter of time, that in this game, a decade is a long time, and in the long run, there is no distinction between arming ourselves and arming our enemies. Thus, each terrifying discovery merely increases our subjection to the need of making a new discovery. Barring a new awareness on the part of our leaders, this is bound to go on and on until the entire intellectual potential of the land is drained from any possible constructive application to the manifold needs of the race, old and new. The effect of these weapons must be to increase the entropy of this planet until all distinctions of hot and cold, good and bad, man and matter have vanished in the formation of the white furnace of a new star.
Yeah,
it goes on, but I think you get the point.
Wiener at his best is pretty amazing. Yeah, that's great. What was the Stuart Mill quote?
Yeah, John Stuart Mill. So this is from the book On Liberty, which is a famous book in political philosophy, I guess. And it sort of puts forth his liberty principle, which is sort of part of the foundation, I think, of modern liberalism. Well, I'm not sure how much modern liberalism is like. I don't really know about that stuff. But anyway, it's a historically important book. And this quote is in the introduction, so it's very early on in the book. He says this. So this was relevant to the consumerism point or critique of liberty. And I just wanted to say that I think you could read this as John Stuart Mill making like a qualification of the same kind when he's so he's like acknowledging this is like a I'll read the quote. Liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. Until then, there is nothing for them but implicit obedience to an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they are so fortunate as to find one. But as soon as mankind have attained the capacity of being guided to their own improvement by conviction or persuasion, parenthetical, a period long since reached in all nations with whom we need here concern ourselves, compulsion, either in the direct form or in that of pains and penalties for non-compliance, is no longer admissible as a means to their own good and justifiable only for the security of others. So that his liberty principle is basically that you can only restrict someone's liberty to prevent harm to others. So he's basically saying that the liberty principle only works if people are kind of trustworthy to be free and like make their own decisions. So I'm not exactly sure if this is how it was intended, but I'm reading it in this case. You could maybe make a criticism of the liberty principle applying in the modern world by saying, well, maybe we've kind of lost that. Whatever has happened between now and back then when John Stuart Mill was saying all countries that we need concern ourselves with have reached this level, maybe we're not as responsible or kind of virtuous or We don't have the kind of social robustness to create individuals capable of being trusted with liberty today. So it might not be a problem with the liberty principle as per John Stuart Mill, but a problem with the kind of people. And maybe if we could work on the people, we could maybe get back to liberty being okay or something like that.
And I would add an observation to that, which is that the caveat, Mill's caveat at the end of the principle is, so long as it doesn't harm, so long as others aren't harmed, right? And this has come to be the embodied in this idea that your rights of liberty stop when they at impinging upon the other rights of others. And fair enough. The one complicating factor there, though, is that you can redefine harm. And I think we've seen some interesting developments in that direction, especially just very recently, within the last 10 or 15 years. So, for example, the rise of ideas around triggering and microaggressions and that sort of thing. These are redefinitions of ideas like being harmed and being attacked and being victimized, and they're worth considering. I don't mean to dismiss them or belittle them in any way, but I'm just illustrating how they are applicable as responses to the logic of liberty in relation to harm to others. It depends very much on how harm is defined, and there is no universal, unequivocal, objective definition of harm. Harm is very much something that must be negotiated socially and culturally, and has been and is very much over time, and it can and has changed over time. So that's worth just adding to that for context.
Yeah, I think there's a deeper critique of that quote, which I've discussed with some Chinese intellectuals, which is that the hypothesis didn't hold then, doesn't hold now. It was easier to be ignorant of that fact, and it's harder to be ignorant of it now. So there's a great passage, I've seen Zizek talk about it quite a bit, very poetically, which is that it's a delusion to think that you should know your neighbor better in order to love them. Actually, the less you know about your neighbor, the better, because that's the only way you can tolerate them. So when it comes to
fences make good neighbors.
Yeah, right. So with respect to liberty, the idea that liberty doesn't apply anterior to the state where people can be improved by discussion. Well, what if one day you discover you just have more knowledge about the state of mind of people as a mass, and you discover that actually that doesn't really make any sense, and that democracy or liberty is predicated on a belief about other people that empirically doesn't hold. Now, I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm saying that to a large degree, the ideals we hold in the West about democracy and liberty have weak foundations that are predicated partly on kind of a fiction that we all agree to, which is that what John Stuart Mill just said really does apply to all the countries that we need concern ourselves with. And a Chinese intellectual, or a fascist, or not to equate those two, they're not at all the same, but alternative traditions which have a different attitude towards the proper role of the state in coercing individuals in various directions, we'll just point to that argument and say, well, where's your evidence for that? Now, back in John Stuart Mill's day, you just couldn't gather the evidence, so it was possible to maintain that view and not be refuted. But we have Facebook. We've done the experiment. People are not like that. So it's very difficult. You can continue then to just, maybe find alternative foundations. And I would agree that that's the right thing to do. And I would say that's how I view the world. I don't actually view that as the strong argument for liberty. But there are others who will just point out the flaws in your logic and not politely ignore them. So I guess that's
I think that there is an assumption that's embedded there that I don't think holds perfectly. And tell me whether or not I don't know how how much it undermines the conclusions that follow, Dan. But the assumption I don't comfortable with there is that that a person can be evaluated with finality. And and I mean, yes, we see a lot of shittiness. We see the worst of people in many instances on social media, for example, and we see nastiness that comes out. But I think maybe this is part of the secular humanist perspective. Maybe it's even part of the older traditions that predate them, that mindset. But certainly my personal view is that people are complicated. There are angels of our better nature, and there are the worst can come out under bad circumstances. But that people can be redeemed, and that forgiveness has value, and that people can grow and learn and change, and people can govern themselves. They can become better, and that you can't render a final judgment on character. It isn't appropriate to do that. It isn't appropriate at any given moment to decide that a person is good or bad, or has successfully or unsuccessfully met a standard ethically or morally or otherwise, but rather that people have the potential to always be works in progress and can always improve, and that redemption is always possible. And it's a very old ethic in some cultures, and it manifests differently, in different traditions. It manifests differently in secularism than in religion and so forth. But there's enormous amount of power in that premise, as opposed to the premise that, well, you can simply render judgment upon a person and that's it. And if you could know a person's mind, you could judge them to be good or bad, and that's the end of the story. And I don't think people's stories are reducible like that. I think that there's always a circumstance in the future under which a person could achieve some redemption and then become by any standard, whatever standard it might be, different or better person. And so that would be, to me, that seems like a pretty darn fatal flaw in the line of logic about judging people, saying, well, we run the experiment and it turns out people are shitty and can't be trusted. Well, maybe, but maybe that presumes people cannot be redeemed, and that there's no room for growth. So anyway, sorry, naive optimism shining through, guys. Apologize with.
I think it's that people could be redeemed seems to only give us, not, for example, liberalism is nevertheless okay, because we are just because a child is going to grow up into a competent adult, we don't let them drive on the road until they are like a competent adult. So like liberalism, we're not ready for it, or something like that would be the conclusion, I think, out of your thing. We can't say that we'll never be ready for it. So the response becomes, how can we, for example, work towards having a society where people are meeting Mill's criteria for the foundation of liberalism?
Yeah, I would agree with what Adam said. That's what I mean by new foundations. So I will be in favor of liberty up to and past the point where the mob comes to my door believing that I should be taken away and my thoughts suppressed. And I will keep believing in their liberty, but that doesn't mean the mob will not be there. And they'll be there for you too, Adam, techno-optimist, enabling the apocalypse. But let's go back to the gambler's fallacy that you want to engage in. So let me summarize this in the nastiest way possible. So what you're saying is that technology got us into this problem. Maybe it's not the Enlightenment. We certainly could have ended up with climate change with a completely different set of historical circumstances. So I think blaming climate change on the Enlightenment is not only historically wrong, but just stupid. I mean, if the Third Reich had won, we'd still be in this exact pickle, right? So it's got nothing to do with the Enlightenment.
It's quite possible it would be worse under other value systems
almost
and economic systems, for sure. Yeah.
So that doesn't make any sense. But okay, I wasn't describing what I think is true. I was describing what I think people think. Okay,
Absolutely. Yep.
okay, so we've ended up in this pickle as a result of technological progress. And then, oh, conveniently, the only way to go forward is to keep doing the same stuff. So we should keep giving the power to the same people, or maybe a set of people that you think will better bear it, and go forward making the same exact bets over and over again until some point where it will all work out. That sounds like the kind of argument that if your husband makes it after spending your entire income down at the races, you're qualified to sue for divorce. But no, this is a good argument. Oh, what am I missing here? Why should we just keep going and be sure that things will work out differently?
Yeah, it's a great framing of the question, and there are you put your finger on two different aspects of it, which I think they're conflated, but they may be slightly different. The one is that we've sort of committed ourselves. There's sort of a commitment to a path dependent. We're on a trajectory that we can't veer away from very easily or plausibly, and that we can't reverse course on very easily or plausibly. We can't go back. It's very difficult to go back to where we came. And you put your finger right on it. Well, you can easily spin that into a framing about that rationalizes the continuation of the worst offenses, and those worst offenses can be things like continued ecological damage in the short term, or they can be offenses, social and ethical and justice offenses, like, well, the people who have benefited from the system so far, the rich and the powerful, will continue to be rich and powerful, and so it's in their interest to rationalize continuing on as we have been. So it's a very powerful critique, and it's a difficult thing to respond easily to. I am struggling, and maybe you can help me come up with a succinct response to this, because it is very difficult, at least so far as I've thought through this. It's difficult to dismiss the criticism, but other than to say, yeah, but it's true. And the yeah, but it's true is, we have come down this path this far, and we can't realistically turn back, and that is simply a fact. And so what else do you want to do? And all of the alternatives are worse, right? And that's one of I spend a bit of time pointing out that the alternatives really are worse. And I mentioned earlier, going backwards, destroying the global economy, for example, degrowing to try to return to some previous state of affairs with 8 billion people would be an apocalypse in itself. It would be an absolute catastrophe to attempt that. So we don't really have any other choice but, as you say, to gamble on progress. A metaphor that I like that I haven't used that I didn't use in the book. I had a whole bunch of metaphors in the book. Dan, you probably remember some of the earlier ones, and I took them all out and only left the burning house metaphor in there. That's the only one that's left in there. But I had the sinking ship, and I had a whole bunch of other metaphors in there. One metaphor that I've used in the past that I quite like is about foolishly, recklessly committing to a path forward is, it's like rounding a corner, run at a full sprint, full speed, and then realizing you've come face to face with it. There's a chasm, and you either keep going and then leap across it, because if you stumble and balk and slow down, well, there isn't enough time to stop and not plunge into the abyss. So if you hesitate and you balk and you slow down, that's what's going to doom you. The only hope you've got is to hit the gas, pedal to the metal, and hope you can make the leap. And if you're genuinely in that situation, well, how else do you? Without using metaphors, I don't know how to argue for it if it's simply a fact. If it's just the reality, if it's just the fact of the situation. And then, sorry, one more thing. You can add some nuance to this. Let me invoke another analogy to add some nuance. Okay, so here's another analogy. We're a dumb teenager, just like the one who rounded the corner and at a full sprint blindly and then realized they were in hot water. Well, here's another analogy. You're a dumb teenager and you're swimming and you decide to do a swim through a tunnel in a cave or something like that. And you get a ways through it and you think, oh man, I'm running out of air here. This was really dumb. What a stupid, reckless, irresponsible adventure to have undertaken. So what's the solution when you find yourself in that situation? Well, let me add some nuance to this situation. Okay, you're more than halfway towards the exit. So you can't stop and turn around and swim back. That's stupid, because that's harder and worse, and you're more likely to drown doing that than just continuing forward if you're more than halfway to the way out. So the way out is through. Okay, that's part of this.
I think instead of being more than halfway to the exit, are you trying to say you've gone more than half of your air in and you wouldn't be able to make it back? Because you might not know how far the tunnel goes, like, and how far the exit is, right?
That's you could say that. Let's say you can see the light from the from the tunnel, the exit. But nevertheless, you might panic and think, well, geez, I better turn around and retreat from this danger. But of course, that would be the wrong move, especially if you didn't know. Okay, and yeah, that's interesting nuance. If you didn't know exactly how far it was to the exit, I would argue we can see the exit now, and so we can see that it's closer to get to it that way than to try to turn around. But here's some nuance, which is also interesting, and that is, we're running out of air. Should you sprint towards the exit as fast as you can? Should you just plod on as you have been and hope you make it? Or should you slow down but continue forward progress towards this, continuing through, not turn around, but just slow down, because maybe you'll conserve some air that way. You won't burn through your air as fast. And which of those gives you a better chance of actually making it to the exit? And that's subtle, right? I mean, that's, should and there you can, anyway, I didn't end up using this analogy because it's too subtle, too complicated, it's too easy to get lost, it's too easy to poke holes in or whatever. But so I didn't use that in the book or my other work, but I bring it up here because it is interesting to think through, right? Should we be making a mad dash of progress right now? Should we be accelerating technological progress to get to the finish line, to get to the city on the hill or whatever it is, to get out of this tunnel we're stuck in? Or should we just carry on? Is that the smart thing to do? Or wouldn't it be smart to do a bit of both? Shouldn't we slow down a little bit, take our time a little bit more, conserve our air, but still make forward progress towards the exit? What is the right thing to do here? And it becomes sort of a, I don't know, you mathematicians know better than me. It becomes the kind of optimization problem where you're trying to minimize the area under the curve, something like that. And you have to figure out what the best strategy is there. If there's a subtlety. So
I think here you're a bit too nice. I would make, I think, a better analogy is you're on a ship and you're sailing to another continent. You've hit bad weather, you've lost most of your food, and you don't know if you can make it or not, but to turn back would seem rationally to be the certain doom. But it's not like mutinies never happen under that circumstance. I think that the framing of this discussion is not sufficiently concerned about the potential for revolt. So let me compare what you just said. Yeah, I mean, I agree, right? It's difficult to refute this argument. And it does seem actually there's a good argument for keeping power in the hands of the people who have held it thus far, because to dismantle the world economy would be to guarantee a lack of progress and therefore that our problems don't get solved. And as you say in the book, that's almost certainly the worst thing we could try and do right now. But there are many historical analogues to societies in exactly those positions, and the rational arguments don't always win the day, or almost never win the day. So just to give one example, so China in the early 20th century was in the hand of the nationalist government, as probably most of you know, who was kind of a continuation. I mean, in principle there was a revolution which replaced the dynastic system, and then it was a modern state in some sense. In practice, there was a lot of continuation of the bureaucratic institutions, and the same kind of families who were in power in the 19th century remained in power in the early 20th century. And there was a strong argument for that. Chiang Kai-shek was making that argument, Lin Yutang and many other intellectuals made that argument. Look, the world's a dangerous place, right? We have to modernize, we have to build up our economy, or we'll be invaded. We're already being invaded by the Japanese. You want to go taking the entire foundation away and replacing it, killing all the landlords, just changing the whole system in this circumstance? That's suicide, right? Okay, yeah, it's a bad idea to keep power in the hands of the existing power holders, and we know they're corrupt. But look, we don't have any good alternative. We just need to keep going, and trust us, we'll get to the place we're trying to get to. You just have to put up with the current status quo for a bit longer. That's actually a really weak argument, and a dangerously weak argument, because the forces that are out there wanting the entirely different approach, they're maybe not reachable anymore. I think the opposition to technologically led progress is much deeper than the climate of our discussion is sort of, I mean, it's very Enlightenment centered, right? And it's very much, well, we have a reason and therefore people should just buy the reason. I think they're past that. I think many people are past that, and this despair that you're talking about has curdled in many people into an opposition that I think is, to be frank, unreachable by your book. And I hope your book stops more people from moving into that camp. But I think the question we should be asking is, even given sustained, strong political and physical opposition to technological progress, how can we make sure it continues something like that? So, I would be more in favor of circling the wagons and making sure that we have enough physical power to prevent people from stopping technological progress. I think that's what it's going to take.
Yeah. Let me respond to that with a few thoughts. So I agree that the sentiments can run very strong and very deep in some people. The despair and the resentment, and with good reason, right? Based on what people think they know, and people don't. There are things that people don't know. Especially, there's an enormous amount of ignorance about technology and how fast changes can happen, and how close we are to, for example, most of humanity's energy coming from clean, renewable sources. People think we're 100 years away or 50 years away, and we're not. So there's a lot of ignorance to overcome there. But even still, I do not deny that despair and then resentment of the current situation is very, very deep in many people. So this doesn't. I don't mean to diminish that at all. I personally remain hopeful because I've had so many positive experiences of people who have told me, and my organization directly, I was in utter despair, and I found your thinking and arguments persuasive, and thank you for lifting me out of that despair. So it can happen, but I'm under no illusions that that would be necessarily the majority of people who came into contact with this line of thinking and evidence. Okay. But having so that's one thing. Having said that, my next question, again, and it is a little bit related to the no choice but to gamble on progress, is in the current situation, in the current circumstances, what power to effect change do the despairing and the disgruntled have? How so this is something that the for example the degrowth community has been very frustrated about for a long time, for a couple of generations. I mean, Herman Daly wrote The Steady State Economy, and the field of ecological economics emerged more than 30 years ago. And Paul Ehrlich has been around, the neo-Malthusians have been around for a long time. and the question is, how much power do they actually have to influence things? And so that, I think that's a pragmatic question, and one that we would do well to look at history to try to understand. One might be tempted to say, well, they don't have any real teeth. Yes, you could make a lot of noise about how we need to shrink the economy, but it just isn't going to happen because nobody with any real power would enact those sorts of policies and so forth. And yeah, okay, well, maybe people will just get fed up and start mobbing and marching on capitals and so forth in the name of degrowth and anti-technology, except that, they're going to meet people with, the people marching in the name of poverty and fewer and less tools are going to encounter people who are rich with lots of tools, and they aren't going to stand a chance, kind of thing. So that's the straw man. The question is, what does that really look like? What kind of threat does populism of the anti-technology and anti-progress and anti-growth kind really look like? What could that look like? What kind of real threat could that pose? And I think that that's a very important question to ask. So yeah, I would I think I would put that on the table and say, let's chat about that for a minute and see, what can we think about, especially through the lens of history. Has this happened before? Under what circumstances? Could it happen again under, conceivably under modern circumstances, and so on?
Yeah, I think there are two things that seem to be a consensus in Washington right now. China is bad and big tech needs to be regulated, right? And everything else is up for debate. Isn't there a very clear, it's not like degrowth is actually stated as an aim, but it's the de facto consequence of regulation, bureaucratic inertia, and so on. You just look at the vaccine rollout in the United States or 100 other things that the government tries to do. In practice, it's actually anti-growth, not through any design, but just kind of by the logic of the system. All you need to do is make Silicon Valley more like Washington, D.C., and you'll have achieved 80% of that agenda, right? Not that Silicon Valley is the only place where technological progress happens. By no means is that true. The energy disruptions you're talking about doesn't owe a lot to Silicon Valley, for example. But I could easily see an emerging consensus around opposition to AI and other forms of technological progress. You outline basically in your book the foundation for a political movement against all of these disruptions. You say the fishers will be pissed and lose all their jobs. Many small towns will just cease to exist. Cultures will disappear. Traditions will disappear. Many farmers will be pissed and lose their jobs and lose their farms and make bets and go bankrupt unless we do something. But those things that you're hoping will happen will probably happen too slowly to matter. You'd probably have to agree. Although a bit later, I hope we come to a discussion of what young people can do. And I think we need armies of young, talented, technologically literate people to go out there and advise communities on how to survive these disruptions, especially farmers and people in primary industries, it seems to me. Okay, so maybe those people succeed, but they won't succeed completely. There will be many people in the same position as people in the Midwest in the US are now, post loss of the industrial base, in despair, addicted to opiates, except it will be the farmers also and the fishers and many other communities. Isn't that on its own, combined with opposition to progress in AI that freaks people out and seems unnatural? This seems to me like just they're sitting there to be turned into a political force. I don't see why this political force can't be strong enough to put serious brakes on some of these disruptions. It seems to me the only real thing that could stop them. I think I agree that the things in your book are likely to happen, but when I ask myself the question, in the history, future history, this doesn't happen, the thing that occurs to me is the reason it didn't happen is that this political consensus emerges in the next 5 to 10 years and just wrenches the gears sideways.
Yeah, that's a it's interesting. It is an interesting way of framing it. So, I mean, certainly one possibility, one thing to admit as a possibility is that is that there could be cultures that do not navigate these changes successfully. That is that is certainly something that has happened in the past with technological change, and sometimes it takes a long while for a culture to come to grips with disruption. It's not always smooth sailing. There are winners and losers, unfortunately, and history overwhelmingly has shown that the regions, the communities, the nations, the different units of analysis, the industries, so on and so forth, the individual companies that embrace and accelerate and seize leadership roles become the winners when a technological regime changes and we shift from one paradigm to another disruptively over the course of some short amount of time, 10, 20 years. That's what we've seen historically. Winners and losers, and the winners are those who embraced and accelerated the disruptions. The winners have seldom, if ever, been those who opposed and resisted the new technology. We don't have examples in history really to point to where that's the case.
Before you move on,
sure.
Just quickly want to ask a clarifying question about that data that you're pointing to. Would be some kind of selection thing where if you successfully resist a disruption, then it doesn't happen?
We don't have cultures sitting in isolation technologically, and so
no, but I mean, like, if, for example, if the resistance wins, then the disruption might not happen kind of anywhere. I don't know. I'm just asking if you think that's
well, yeah, that's definitely happened. That's definitely happened where disruptions have caused so much chaos writ large that they've been difficult for societies to reorganize around. And that has happened. I mean, we have had individual civilizations have collapsed. We've had periods of what historically we might call dark ages. Although there's the dark ages aren't what they once were. I think that the dark ages were not as dark as was once believed in many places, for example. But nevertheless, it is true that societies can fail, can collapse to levels of much lower wealth, prosperity, complexity, however you want to measure, define and measure success. We've seen countries and not countries. We've seen societies and cultures fail, and technology disruptions have been involved in those. That's certainly the case. But what we haven't seen so much of is, as I was saying, we haven't seen so much of where a country or a culture or a society or a community ended up becoming a winner, ended up succeeding and thriving and prospering because they did not adopt a new technology. That is something we have not seen, not to my knowledge. Now, I'd be delighted to be shown a counterfactual to that, to see an exception to that. But I am not aware of one. So that's a distinction. Does that make sense?
Well, what about, I don't know about, America had a debate about whether it wanted to industrialize and then did industrialize. I think there were countries in South America who made the opposite decision, didn't they? I mean, there was in the early days when England had industrialized, but other countries were choosing whether or not to follow their path and build factories and so on. There were active political debates about whether it was a good idea or not, based on the values of each individual country. And some countries, maybe they didn't actively decide not to do it, but they dragged it out sufficiently long that they ended up not having the choice to do it. And that's not a particular technology, you could say. It's a kind of raft of technologies to do with the first industrial revolution, but certainly there were countries who chose to not adopt or not get on the bandwagon sufficiently early. I mean, I think you could say that about many modern technologies, and that's a reason why the US is the leader economically in the world, right? It's the country that actually jumps on every bandwagon it sees, and many other countries sort of delay and debate and end up not having the choice to actually lead the disruptions. You could point to Europe and the internet, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then I think if we then go and look at the data, we look at the measures of social and individual well-being, of which there are many, dozens, right? Now this is debated. Again, there is scientific debate, there's political debate, there's moral and philosophical debate about what constitutes progress and what constitutes human well-being. Now, I personally find most of that debate a little vacuous and very tiresome. And again, I find a lot of it quite distasteful. And it's coming from people who, in my mind, are really quite privileged and naive. But there is debate among scholars and philosophers and folks about, should literacy really be part of the definition of progress? Should lifespan really be how you define progress? Should income and should production and should all these lots and lots of other measures of progress, should they really be defined as progress? Do they really translate into happiness? Do they really translate into well-being? And so there is debate there. I come down pretty hard on one side of that personally, but for reasons I already mentioned earlier. But it is a debated question, right? What is an agrarian society really less successful and less prosperous than an industrial society? Are the richest countries in the world really more prosperous than the poorer countries in the world? And the United States is an interesting exception here, right? Certainly at the unit of analysis of the entire nation, it doesn't top the list in many metrics of well-being, despite being quite highly ranked in wealth, and that's because of disparities within the society. So I think there's room to debate and disagree on exactly what constitutes progress and what constitutes success. And I do tackle this a little bit towards the end of the book. It was a conundrum I ran into with students at UCLA in the classes that I taught. People don't agree what a good life is, or what how they want to live, or where they want to live, or what makes them happy. And so it's very difficult to sort of form an objective definition of prosperity and progress. It's tough. In the discussions that I had, it was interesting because the compromise we would almost always settle on was that real prosperity gives people more freedom of choice, gives people more options, more opportunities, and then people will make different choices because tastes vary and preferences vary. But the real definition of progress is, can you make a choice? Do you have the option? Do you have the opportunity to realize, to take steps towards realizing your preferences? So it's an interesting sort of solution to that challenge of how to define prosperity and progress. But by the measures of wealth and health and literacy and education and access to amenities and those sorts of things that are reasonably strongly institutionalized, they're contested. But, like, for example, United Nations Human Development Index is a longstanding metric, a composite index of progress and prosperity. If you look at that, then the rich industrial countries are more prosperous and do have a higher index score than the countries that chose not to, for example, embrace industrialization or to embrace other technological bandwagons, as Dan said, when the opportunity first arose. And so, yeah, this is, but I should stress that, it's possible that that won't be a winning strategy going forward. I mean, it's possible it won't be the same this time around as it has been in the past, as the other times around. So I'm open to that possibility, but history tells us we should expect prosperity to correlate very strongly with countries that embrace technological progress.
Okay. In the last 20 minutes or so, I want to, I guess it's been kind of a negatively slanted discussion, me trying to poke holes in your book, but I want to finish with...
No, it's great. It's really helpful. Thanks. Because this, of course, is what I'm going to get a lot of this.
Yeah.
Practice, man. I'm taking notes furiously here.
There's a couple of paragraphs reading your book where I thought, I can see Adam standing in front of this particular group of academics and getting roasted. Yeah, you've set yourself up for some interesting discussions. How about that?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So the final question I want to talk about is what young people can do in practical terms, in career terms, to assist with making these disruptions go well. So your book is quite unique, I would say. This isn't a view that you get in many places, and I think it's likely to be more accurate than the view you would get other places, and it would lead you to take different courses of action than you would if you hadn't read and believed this book. So you would give career advice that people wouldn't usually be getting. I don't know that so many people would say a no-brainer is to get ready for figuring out how to allocate millions and millions of hectares to new uses, but that would probably seem like an obvious recommendation, I would think, given what you've written in the book. So I'll ask you that directly in a second, but I also wanted to mention that the book that most reminded me of yours was Stuart Brand's book, Whole Earth Discipline. I don't know if you've read it.
It's a favorite of mine, sure.
Yeah. So that book is kind of, I think it was the Whole Earth Catalogue that had the subtitle, "We Are as Gods and We Should Get Used to It," or "Get Good at It," or something like that. That definitely is a theme I see running through your book as well, right? It's the idea that, well, at first you can be skeptical of the power that's coming into our hands, but once you accept it, the mature thing to do is to figure out how to deploy that power well. And that's a responsibility that we're doubtfully prepared for, to put it mildly. You refer to this as the movement from something to stewardship. What was the term you used? Like our relationship to the environment.
Yes, in the very end, I characterize it as a shift from sustainable exploitation, which is sort of where the mindset the current environmental movement is centered. Is sustainability still involves exploitation of nature, just in to a degree that's small enough that nature can withstand that insult. There's I think not one but two sort of steps beyond that. The first is to move to a regime of restoration, and I think that's the one you're talking about before. Stewardship. Restoration means we have to get very busy repairing the damage we've done historically, and that we will be in a position to do it. That's difficult to imagine now, but like you said, it's also difficult for folks to imagine we'll have a lot of land freed up from current uses in animal agriculture to repurpose, and so we're going to have to get good at doing restoration work. But that's not the end of the, that's not the true end game. In my mind, the real end game is stewardship, where we genuinely do protect and guard the rest of the living world based on a preservation ethic. In other words, based on the intrinsic value of the rest of the living world itself, not based on any instrumental value it holds for us in realizing our own interests and goals. And that's that would be quite a profound shift from certainly from where we are now, and even from the ostensibly sustainable vision that I think is really quite weak and meager, rather than a lofty and admirable aspiration that is where most of environmental discourse is now. So yeah, hope that clarifies.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, I want to bundle a few questions together. So, stewardship, well, maybe I'll start by dismissing a blockage that I think might be in people's heads. So back when the Industrial Revolution was just getting started, it seemed like such hubris to imagine that human beings could affect the face of the planet to the degree that they now have. Like, to worry about overfishing seemed like hubris. It wasn't just that it seemed preposterous or silly or premature. It actually had a stronger valence to it, as though it was actually immoral to worry about that. Like, it wasn't our place to worry about that. And I do think that when people think about the leverage that humans are about to acquire over the natural world, to get ready for that in an appropriate way, in a proportionate way, and quickly, because we may not have much time, I think will strike many people as hubristic in exactly the same way, as though like it's actually immoral to think about this and to plan your life around it, because it seems like not humanity's place to be worrying about such things. So I want to point at that, name it, and then push it aside, because I think we need to get over that, especially young people who are going to be living more in this world than middle-aged folks like us are. Okay, so putting aside whether or not humanity deserves this power, we're going to get it. And it's incumbent on us to be good enough to wield it and deserve it, maybe. So, okay, let's go through a few practical things. I mean, the ones that occurred to me reading through the book were to do with land usage, and I guess I already named that one, right? So as you say in the book, some enormous percentage of the Earth's surface, is it something like 50%, is dedicated to I forget the exact figure, or 80% of something was to do with animal husbandry, right? So maybe you know the exact figure off the top of your head, but it's a really ridiculous percentage of the Earth's surface is under our control and deployed to the purposes of looking after cattle and other large animals.
Yeah, so about 30% of the world's surface is land, and about 2/3 of that is habitable, so it's not glaciers and it's not barren desert. And then about half of that habitable land we use for agriculture. And so that's about 1/3 of the total land area of the Earth's surface. 1/3 of the total land area we use for agriculture. And of that 1/3 of the total land surface of the planet that we use for agriculture, almost 80% of that 1/3 is dedicated to animals, livestock, grazing, pasture, growing crops to feed to animals, including crops to feed to aquaculture, in other words, to create seafood and so on. So in all, about 25% of the surface of the Earth, of the land area of the Earth, is specifically allocated to animals. So animal husbandry is probably the most comprehensive way to say it. So animal farming, animal husbandry. And if we are right, if Rethink X is right, or even mostly right, really even partly right, about the new food technologies disrupting traditional animal agriculture, because they will simply be vastly more economically competitive. You're going to have better products that cost a fraction of the amount. The old animal-based industries will simply collapse. They won't be able to compete, and they will collapse into small niche markets, just as we've seen with other disruptions in the past. And that will result in the freeing up of 25%, or well, not 25%, but say about 20% of the land area of the Earth. And that is an absolutely enormous amount of land.
Yeah, so let's brainstorm some really concrete jobs slash careers that would make sense in there. So one that occurred to, you mentioned, and I think it's a very interesting topic, how the freeing up of that land interacts with ownership of the land and its sort of destiny and who decides that. And a lot of that land would have been in Australia and in the United States previously occupied before settlement, and the question of how to make use of it could be a very productive place to spend some of the energy that goes into figuring out how to deal with the legacy of the deep negative impacts that that settlement had on native peoples. So NGOs that are like helping local communities to deal with the collapse of the farming industries and figure out what to do with the land seems like an important thing to do. I'm sort of in mind that this disruption is going to create a large vacuum somehow, and it would be easy for large multinational corporations, maybe, as I said on the right board, I don't know if there's a name for it yet, but big vat, like all the precision fermenters, that's going to be a huge industry.
That's awesome. I'm totally telling my team that tomorrow. Big fan. That's awesome.
But I mean, maybe it's like not such a big industry now, but clearly it will be, and those guys are going to be buying up land like nothing, right?
Oh yeah, we're already seeing that. The first instance I've seen was actually just this week. A precision fermentation company called Amyris, I think it is. Is that right? Amyris, Amyrs. They're Brazilian, and they bought up a sugar plantation, and they're siting their precision fermentation right at the. They're co-locating with the production of the sugar feedstock that goes into their
Right.
process. So we're seeing this now. It's beginning.
Yeah. So that, or jobs to do with reforesting. I mean, that's going to be. I don't know how many experts there are in native vegetation and how to reforest. It seems like it's probably not a big source of employment, but it is likely to grow like mad if your predictions are correct. So that would be another important thing for some people to work on. Can you think of others in the context of land usage, like really concrete examples that can get people's minds turning? And then there's other categories as well, but maybe let's start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very large role for government at all levels to play in determining what happens to this land. One of the things that's a complicating factor is that not only is land going to become not only is land going to cease to be used for animal farming, it will have very limited scope to be used economically. In other words, there will be such an overwhelmingly large supply of this land that the value of that land is likely to fall, and it could fall quite low. In other words, it's not as if there is enough alternative land use to animal farming to keep the value of that land, the market value of that land, high. And so, if a farmer, for example, goes out of business, they will not necessarily be able to repurpose that land to some other profitable enterprise. That's not clear that that's possible. And as a result, if they choose to sell that land, it could be that there ends up being a market for that land being very inexpensive. That's going to be very hard on farmers. They're going to lose capital, and that's devastating. On the flip side, that it's possible that conservancies could purchase that land on the cheap when there's a glut of it. But that's again, it's sort of that would be taking advantage of a desperate situation, which I'm quite careful in the book to put us on guard against. So we want to be very cautious there. But one thing to consider here is that all levels of government, from the most local to the national, would benefit very much from planning ahead on how to navigate a glut of land. So individuals who wanted to work in this industry would not be stuck necessarily just working for NGOs. I think we're likely to see potential for successful large government programs to emerge that are dedicated to finding ways to repurpose this land. Some of that may be in things like consolidation. So in the United States and Australia, these are examples of countries that are blessed with massive, enormous endowments of land area. Not every country has that blessing, obviously. But as a result of that incredible endowment, both countries have very large existing conservation, preservation, and wilderness areas. In the United States, we have national parks, national forests, national wildernesses, state forests, state parks, and a number of other kinds of conservation areas. And all of those require management. All of those require planning. All of those require human presence on the landscape. And this is one thing that I do argue in the book, is that conservation ecology is going to be very important at a scale we haven't been able to even dream of contemplating before. And so we would effectively in the United States be looking at massively increasing the amount of land that is, relative to what we currently conserve and what we currently manage under the government ownership. And it could be that expands, and then that employment or opportunities go along with that expansion in the public sector. And so, and again, that's public sector, not at just the national level of government, but all the way down to the very local. And I see that as enormously positive, and it offers the opportunity for civic re-engagement, because lots of young people are sort of disengaged civically. So if local governments were smart, they would find ways to attract and engage young people, and get them interested not only in the environment, nature, and ecological restoration and conservation and rewilding, but that could be a pathway to civic re-engagement more broadly. And we desperately need that. So that would be, I think there's a social opportunity here as well as an ecological opportunity. And both of those can be united around, and I don't want to be delusional here, but they can be united around modest economic opportunities. In other words, job opportunities for people in that space. So that's certainly one thing to think about with respect to land. Another thing to think about is that the disruptions that I'm talking about, some of them are going to require quite a bit of land use. If we are going to be deploying a very large amount of solar and wind power, for example, you need land on which to do that. Now, it's not the kind of proportion of the Earth's surface that people sometimes imagine. It's only a tiny fraction, for example, of the amount of land that we need currently used for agriculture or something like that. So we have to put up a lot of solar panels, but we're talking, orders of magnitude smaller than our current use of the landscape for farming, for example. But we're still talking about, hundreds of thousands of hectares in large countries like or millions in the case of the largest countries like the United States or China. And so those industries are going to be growth industries for quite a while. And so there's opportunity there to both accelerate the disruptions and to find economic opportunity, and to put existing land that's used for agriculture to use in other ways. And then, around land use, I suppose the last thing that I would say is the freeing up of all of that land in rural communities, combined with the other disruptions, especially the disruptions in labor and the disruptions in transportation, mean that people are going to have new choices about where they live and where they work. And I think there will be a strong temptation to expand suburbs, for example, and communities into areas that are suddenly where land is available and cheap and so forth. And we need to think carefully about how we want to how we want to navigate and manage that opportunity, shall we say. Right now, not everybody would agree that we need to massively expand suburbs and have an exodus out of cities because people no longer need to work downtown, and even if they do, they can comfortably commute in from 150 miles away because they can sleep in their electric car on the way there, kind of thing. And they can live in McMansion communities built on all the old farms. It's very easy to see this going in a direction that maybe isn't optimal, according to a variety of metrics, social and ecological and otherwise. But again, that choice that has to be made socially. It has to be made, by communities and by their governments and so forth. But we will make suboptimal choices if we aren't prepared in advance. If we just get blindsided by this, then the developers will swoop in and buy up all the land on the cheap and throw up the crappy McMansions, and before we know it, we'll have a situation that maybe we regret. And I don't mean to. Again, I'm trying to be value neutral here about the social choices that people make. Some people love suburbs and love large single family homes and so forth, and other people really love living in apartments in cities and love the urban environment and so on. So, but we need to be cautious, and we need to be cognizant and aware of all this rather than just getting blindsided by it. And so there's opportunity for young people to engage in all of that. I suppose there's opportunity for young people to build those new suburbs too. But maybe that wouldn't be the optimal outcome. So yeah, the being prepared is a huge part of how societies can successfully deal with these crazy changes, and then the opportunities and pitfalls that come along with them.
Yeah, what
just specifically in terms of land. Yeah, because that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, what does be prepared mean exactly? I think this is a part of your book that I could have done with more detail. So obviously, everybody on Earth should buy your book. But what more does it mean? I mean, do you mean that because we don't know what's going to happen exactly, right? And even your forecasts are fairly broad strokes. So being prepared it's a kind of active engagement or something like that, right? Where you're familiar, you try and maybe as a young person you actually even get into one of these industries. Maybe you get into precision fermentation or AI or some other topic, or at least you pick something and you be a kind of expert or high-level amateur in that area. You're familiar with it, and then you can serve as an interface to people who are maybe older or busier or not keeping up on the technology, and sort of whisper in their ear that things are going to change. Or I mean, how do you see particularly young people serving in this role of being prepared? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, and especially thinking about young people. Let me flip that around and let's think historically and retroactively, like with the wisdom of hindsight. Let's just dial the clock back 30 years. It's 1992. Okay, the first web browser is a year away. The internet is nascent. It's imminent. People can it's sort of in the air. It's in the offing. It's just around the corner. People who are really paying attention can kind of see that. The details are not clear. Many of the finer points are really hard to predict in advance, but some of the broad contours are. If we had known about disruption then and understood it as well as we do now, what would we have told young people then in preparing for the transformation of the information and communications sector? I mean, the world was very profoundly changed by the internet and the rise of the related digital and computing and information technologies, and the information and communications sector was completely transformed, but with both positive and negative consequences. Huge new industries created, trillions of dollars of new value created, lots of benefits, lots and lots of benefits. Free communication, ubiquitous availability of information, which has had a profound impact on lifting the least advantaged people in the poorest countries out of poverty It's very easily underestimated that the impact of that, of the internet and the role it played in that. Interacting with lots of other development going on at the same time, but the internet has had a hugely impactful role. But it hasn't all been roses, right? A lot of it has gone sideways, and a lot of the value was captured in the hands of a few. And we've had, there are some dystopian outcomes, the restriction of information and so forth. So let's do it. Let's do this exercise, but let's do it with the advantage of hindsight. What will we tell young people? How would we tell them to get prepared? If you had a time machine, if we had a time, we could go back and we had a megaphone, we could get on television or whatever and convince the president of the United States and prime ministers elsewhere. If we could tell the world how to get ready better for the 20 years following 1992 and the emergence and ascendance and then maturation of the internet, what would we tell
them? Yeah, that's tough. I mean, the obvious, easy answers are things like choose this career or learn to program or something, but those are not the kind of answers you want, right? Like getting prepared as a society, it's not even clear that is a thing, right?
I mean, I think that it is valid it would have been, perfectly fair to say computers and the internet are going to be a big part of your life. Recognize that, accept that reality, recognize the need to become literate and fluent with these new tools. They're going to play a large role in your future and everyone's future. And resisting or denying or naysaying or poo-pooing them is foolish. I think you mentioned something earlier, which I think is valid, and that's that, for young people, making that adaptation and learning and so forth was relatively easier than for older generations. So young people, help your parents and your grandparents understand these changes and the new opportunities and the new hazards. Don't let your grandmother get scammed. Help your parents learn how to use email sooner rather than later, and so on. Maybe put safeguards and rails on earlier. I don't know if that's specific advice to young people, but don't get on social media when you're in middle school, or it will damage you psychologically. That would be certainly something I would have warned people about.
I have an interesting take on this. I think my recommendation would be to play more. So when I think about so some people have commented on my son's relationship to video games as being very healthy. Many kids are kind of addicted or show clear signs of addiction to devices, and Russell doesn't seem to. That seems to be a consequence of me just having played many games and knowing what's trashy and addictive and what's not. So I'm very comfortable in that territory, and I share the great things, and I keep him away from the not so great things. That's actually really hard for many people who don't have that relationship. I mean, games is one example of a sort of new technological medium where you can be familiar or not. Being familiar has upsides that are hard to anticipate because they mostly come in the form of judgment that is hard to acquire and hard to communicate. I mean, our family friends ask me sometimes, okay, well, how should I do this with my kid, right? How do I get them to get the benefits of all the amazing science content on YouTube and some of the great, interactive experiences you can have with games, but not have them be a wirehead, and that's, I don't know, right? I can give some broad ideas of what I'm doing when I make those decisions, but it's actually incommunicable fundamentally. It's just a matter of taste and judgment. So the only way you get that taste and judgment, it kind of seems really weird to go and deliberately play a lot of games even though you don't like it in order to acquire some judgment on that front. I don't think that actually works. I think if you think about why young people acquire judgment in areas that are new technologically, say the internet, well, we were there and we were playing with it when it started, right? Because we were kids ourselves and gave ourselves the time and freedom to just mess around with it. And later that turns into judgment that has economic value, but I think that's secondary. So I think, yeah, maybe my key recommendation would be to put yourself in front of some of these disruptions, say, I don't know, precision fermentation, and I don't know, make milk in your backyard or whatever the hell the equivalent is of messing around with the internet. I don't know. But there has to be some element of undirected just engagement and curiosity about these phenomena, which is what young people are good at after all.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I have to get going, you guys. But I love leaving on this. It's a beautiful note to leave the conversation on. The idea that learning to play is one of the greatest ways that we can prepare for the unknown. I mean, I suppose this is why so many animals play, is because it's a way of preparing a system for encountering uncertainty and being able to manage that successfully. I think that's really beautiful, Dan. I'm going to be thinking about that and what that might mean in the days ahead. That's really, maybe we can return to that a little bit next time before we, move on to the subsequent topic. One thought very quickly that occurs to me is that the future that I think we're imagining, if we're successful and we avoid catastrophe, is one of material abundance, tremendously more prosperity, certainly materially, and hopefully a world of more opportunity and just possibility that can be explored. This is certainly the dream, and it's been the dream of science fiction for generations, to free human beings from the shackles of toil and drudgery, but it also means that we need to learn and play and experiment now in order to figure out how can we successfully live lives where we don't need to toil in order to earn a crust. And of course, the aristocracy was terrified of this in centuries past. That if the riffraff had leisure time, they would get up to no good, and they would be layabouts, or they would be self-destructive, or destructive of others, or destructive of social order, and so on. And of course, that was hilariously hypocritical, because of course people living, aristocrats have successfully led lives of leisure for thousands of years, and I suppose some of them have been useless layabouts, stoned on the couch, but many of them weren't. And occasionally you had people like Charles Darwin and emerge from that kind of background, and so on. Maybe what we need to do is start playing and experimenting now with a generation of humanity. Maybe the generation of humanity needs to learn and play and experiment in order to prepare to deal with a life of abundance instead of a life and economy and society built around scarcity. And that may take some real doing. So anyway, I love that. I love the idea that maybe play is a big part of preparation. That's really, really cool, Dan. I absolutely love that. So thank you. And thank you guys for the discussion. I really appreciate it. Thanks for indulging me. And I'm looking forward to next week.
Yeah, well, thanks for the book. It's not only because I'm your friend, I will say that I think it's profoundly important, and I hope it reaches the audience it deserves, which is very, very large.
Well, thank you, Dan. And please know that our conversations, you and me, they informed a great deal of the book's content, and certainly its themes and spirit. And so I hope when you read it that you saw that reflected in there, your thinking and wisdom that came through in many of the great conversations we've had. And so thank you for that. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Sounds like you owe me a beer. All right.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Take care.